Before we begin, let me make something clear. This talk is not an investigation into anyone's past. It is not a courtroom, and it is certainly not a place to judge someone for being married, divorced, or single. Instead, this lecture is intended for people who stand at a very important crossroads in life, those who are preparing to choose a long-term partner. Because sooner or later, many people face a difficult question. What do I actually need to understand about a person before making a life decision like marriage? Most people try to answer that question by looking at visible facts, their partner's history, their resume of relationships, the outcomes that can be seen from the outside. But the deeper truth is this: facts rarely reveal the structure of a person's thinking. To understand how someone approaches relationships, we must observe something much subtler: the language they use to interpret their experiences. There's a fascinating philosophical idea found in the ancient spiritual text, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It suggests that human life is not shaped merely by events themselves, but by the consciousness that interprets those events. Two people can live through the same experience, the same love, the same conflict, the same loss, yet emerge with completely different understandings of reality. Why? Because what matters most is not what happened. What matters is how the mind organizes the meaning of what happened. And this principle applies very clearly to romantic relationships. When people talk about their past relationships, they are not just telling stories. They are revealing the framework through which they understand relationships themselves. So in this lecture, we are not going to ask the obvious questions. We will not ask directly, have you been married before? Have you ever been divorced? Those questions only reveal biography. Instead, we will listen to something much more revealing. We will listen to how people describe relationships, how they arrange their thoughts, how they prioritize emotions, and how they move from experience to interpretation. Because hidden inside those patterns is a psychological structure, a structure that tells us how a person processes relationships. Today, we will examine this idea through a simple but surprisingly revealing question. Imagine asking someone this: in your opinion, what is the greatest advantage of being in a long-term relationship? At first glance, it seems like an innocent question, but the answers people give often reveal two very different ways of thinking about relationships. One group tends to answer in a structured sequence: structure, process, outcome. In other words, what can be observed, what happens over time, what conclusion can be drawn. Let's look at some examples. 1. You get to understand each other's daily habits. People who have experienced marriage or long-term partnership often give answers like this. Notice the underlying logic. The relationship is not described as an emotional exchange. Instead, it is treated almost like a long-term observation period. Over time, two people begin to see each other's real patterns: sleep habits, spending behavior, reactions to stress, and ways of handling conflict. The process is not romantic. It is observational. And the outcome of that process is practical. You begin to predict where future conflicts may appear. In this sense, the advantage of long-term dating is not excitement. It is risk assessment. 2. You begin to see the other person's flaws more realistically. This answer reveals another important psychological shift. People with relationship experience often assume something fundamental. Every relationship contains imperfections. Instead of expecting perfection, they expect discovery. At first, people see mostly strengths, but over time, flaws become clearer. And experienced individuals often describe a crucial moment in this process. Not the moment when flaws appear, but the moment when a person asks themselves a deeper question: can I live with these flaws? That question transforms romance into decision-making. The language of idealism is replaced by the language of tolerance and compatibility. 3. Emotions fade, but trust accumulates. This statement carries a very specific assumption about human relationships. Emotions are temporary. Trust is cumulative. People who have experienced long relationships often understand that feelings rise and fall. Excitement comes and goes. Disappointment appears. Routine replaces novelty. But something else slowly forms beneath those changing emotions. Reliability. Over time, a person begins to ask a different question. When difficulties arise, will this person still stand beside me? In this framework, the advantage of long-term relationships is not passion, it is stability. 4. You learn how to make decisions together. Marriage, from a psychological perspective, is not simply a romantic bond. It is a continuous decision-making partnership. Where to live, how to manage finances, how to allocate time, how to respond to conflict. Even small decisions become shared negotiations. So long-term dating becomes a rehearsal space, a place where two individuals gradually test something crucial. Can we make decisions together without destroying the relationship? This is not a question of affection. It is a question of cooperation. 5. Eventually, unrealistic expectations disappear. Perhaps the most revealing answer is also the most philosophical. Many people enter relationships with unspoken expectations. They believe love will change someone. They imagine that marriage will solve problems. They hope the future will transform the present. But long-term relationships often dismantle these illusions one by one. Reality slowly replaces fantasy, and what remains is a very different kind of choice. A choice made with open eyes. Not a choice driven by dreams, but a choice made after understanding reality. When we look closely at these responses, a clear pattern emerges. People with long-term relationship experience often describe advantages in terms of verification, realism, decision-making. They do not say, because it feels good. Instead, they say things like, you can confirm things, you can observe patterns, you can make informed decisions. This difference may seem subtle, but it reveals something profound. It shows how experience transforms the way people conceptualize relationships. Where some see emotional closeness, others see a process of evaluation. Where some see romantic possibility, others see structural compatibility. Neither perspective is necessarily wrong, but the gap between them can create serious misunderstandings. Two people can talk about the same relationship, yet operate from completely different frameworks of interpretation. One speaks the language of feelings. The other speaks the language of structure. And unless that difference is recognized, people may believe they understand each other when in fact, they are interpreting the relationship through entirely different lenses. This, perhaps, is one of the most important philosophical lessons about relationships. Love may begin with emotion, but long-term partnership is sustained by understanding. And sometimes the most revealing thing about a person is not their history, but the way they explain it. If you found this perspective helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this lecture with others. Because understanding relationships is not only about love, it is also about learning how people think. Earlier, we explored a simple but revealing idea. People do not merely describe relationships, they reveal the framework through which they understand them. Some speak about relationships in the language of verification, responsibility, and long-term decision-making. Others speak in the language of emotion, connection, and possibility. Neither language is necessarily wrong, but they emerge from different stages of experience. And once we begin to recognize these patterns, something fascinating happens. We realize that a person's past is not always revealed by what they say happened in their life. It is often revealed by how they explain what relationships mean. Let us continue with another. Question 1 that appears simple but reveals a profound difference in perspective. Imagine asking someone this. How do you think people change as a relationship moves from the early stage to a long-term one? Now, when people who have never experienced marriage or long-term cohabitation answer this question, their responses tend to revolve around changes in emotional tone rather than structural shifts in the relationship. For example, many people respond like this. Things are more exciting at first, and later they become more comfortable. At first glance, this sounds perfectly reasonable. Early relationships are often filled with anticipation, nervous energy, and excitement. Everything feels new, but as time passes, that intensity gradually softens. Yet for people who have not yet experienced the full weight of long-term partnership, this shift is rarely interpreted as a problem. Instead, it is understood as a natural transition. Excitement fades, but comfort replaces it. In other words, the relationship moves from emotional intensity toward emotional stability. The assumption is that love has not diminished. It has simply settled into familiarity. Another common response sounds like this. People just stop expressing their feelings as much as they did at the beginning. Here again, the explanation focuses on emotional dynamics rather than structural change. The reduction of affection or verbal expression is not necessarily interpreted as a warning sign. Instead, it is often viewed as evidence of increased closeness. The reasoning goes something like this. If two people are truly close, they no longer need constant reassurance. The bond is assumed to be secure, enough that it no longer requires constant verbal confirmation. The emotional connection, in this interpretation, continues quietly beneath the surface. A third response appears frequently as well. You simply get used to each other. This statement reveals a very interesting psychological assumption. When someone says this, they are describing familiarity as a stabilizing force. The partner is no longer a mysterious figure to be discovered. They become predictable, and predictability brings a sense of safety. Yes, there may be moments of dullness or routine, but those feelings are not necessarily interpreted as negative. Instead, they are seen as part of the natural deepening of the relationship. Another response that often appears is this: you become more natural with each other. In the early stage of romance, people tend to present their best selves. They are attentive, careful, often a little performative. But over time, the effort to impress gradually fades. And for many people without long-term partnership experience, this change is interpreted positively. It signals authenticity. The relationship feels real because the performance has ended. There is less pressure to impress, less anxiety about being judged. What remains is simply the comfort of being oneself. Finally, many people describe the change in a very subtle way. It feels like things become a little less intense. Notice the wording: not worse, not broken, just less intense. The emotional highs are not as dramatic and the lows are not as painful. The relationship stabilizes into something calmer. And for those who have not yet experienced the deeper structural demands of long-term partnership, this softening of emotion is not perceived as a crisis. Instead, it is seen as something that can always be revived. If needed, people believe they can rekindle the excitement through effort, attention, or renewed affection. So when we examine these answers carefully, we notice a clear pattern. People without marriage experience often describe the evolution of relationships in terms of emotional temperature, excitement, comfort, familiarity, naturalness, emotional calm. Their explanations focus on how the relationship feels, not on how it functions structurally. This does not mean their perspective is naive. It simply reflects a stage of understanding in which relationships are still interpreted primarily through emotion and possibility. Now let us move to another question, one that reveals an even deeper difference in perspective. Imagine asking someone this: do you believe living together with someone makes a person more mature? At first glance, this question sounds straightforward, but again, the answers reveal two very different mental frameworks. People who have experienced marriage or cohabitation rarely give a simple yes. Instead, their answers often begin with caution. Some will say something like this: actually, living together can make people more immature if they handle conflict poorly. This answer reflects experience. Sharing a home does not automatically produce growth. In fact, Daily proximity often amplifies tension. Small habits become visible. Irritations multiply. If people respond to these tensions with avoidance or blame, they may become more defensive rather than more mature. So experienced individuals often reject the idea that maturity comes automatically from circumstance. Instead, they see maturity as a conscious choice within difficult situations. Another response frequently appears among those who have lived through long-term partnership. Living together forces you to reflect on yourself. When two people share the same space every day, it becomes increasingly difficult to blame every problem on the other person. Daily life acts like a mirror. Arguments repeat, patterns emerge, and eventually the focus shifts. Instead of asking, "Why is my partner like this?" people begin asking, "Why do I react the way I do?" This shift from judging the other to examining oneself is one of the most powerful psychological transitions in long-term relationships. It is also one of the main reasons people describe cohabitation as a catalyst for maturity. Another answer focuses on responsibility. Living together makes it impossible to avoid responsibility. When two people share a life, problems cannot simply be postponed. Bills must be paid. Decisions must be made. Conflicts must be addressed. In dating, it is often possible to step away temporarily when tensions arise, but shared living removes that escape. Responsibility becomes structural rather than optional, and this structural responsibility forces people to confront parts of themselves they might otherwise ignore. Another insight appears in responses about emotional regulation. Managing emotions becomes much more important. In early romance, emotional expression is celebrated. But when people share a home, emotional control becomes just as important as emotional honesty. Uncontrolled anger, resentment, or impulsive reactions can disrupt not only the relationship, but daily life itself. Maturity, therefore, becomes the ability not to suppress emotion, but to manage it wisely. Finally, many experienced individuals summarize the entire issue in one striking sentence: maturity is a choice. The same situation can produce completely different outcomes. Some people grow, others repeat the same conflicts for years. Living together does not guarantee maturity. It simply creates circumstances where immaturity becomes harder to sustain. Now compare this perspective with the responses of people who have never experienced cohabitation or marriage. Their answers often sound different. They might say, "I think living together would help people grow a lot." Or, "You probably learn how to be more considerate." Or, "It must make people more mature than living alone." These responses reveal something important. They are not describing experienced reality. They are describing anticipated possibility. Living together is imagined as a transformative event, a stage where people naturally develop empathy, understanding, and responsibility. And in many cases, this optimism is not entirely wrong, but it remains rooted in expectation rather than lived experience. Finally, let us consider one more revealing question. Imagine asking someone, "Why do you think the way people end relationships matters?" People with long-term relationship experience often answer this question with remarkable seriousness. Some say, "Because the way a relationship ends affects the rest of your life." Others explain, "It's not just about emotion, it's about responsibility." Some mention family connections, children, or the wider social impact of relational decisions. Others simply say, if a relationship isn't properly resolved, it stays with you. In other words, experienced individuals tend to see endings not as isolated emotional events, but as structural turning points in life. But when people without such experience answer the same question, their perspective often centers on emotional care. They might say, "Because it's respectful," or "so people don't hurt each other more than necessary," or "to avoid bad memories," or even "so you can move on to the next relationship." In this framework, Ending a relationship is primarily about managing emotions and preserving dignity, rather than shaping long-term life structures. When we step back and look at all these responses together, an important realization emerges. The difference is not about who is right and who is wrong. The difference lies in which stage of experience someone has passed through. Human beings tend to describe relationships using the language of the stage they have personally experienced. Those who have faced the consequences of long-term partnership often speak in terms of structure, responsibility, and outcome. Those who have not yet crossed that threshold often speak in terms of emotion, openness, and possibility. And this pattern reflects a deeper philosophical truth. As the ancient spiritual text, the Tibetan Book of the Dead suggests, human consciousness evolves through experience. Each stage leaves traces not only in memory, but in the language we use to interpret life. That is why people who have lived through the realities of commitment often speak differently about love. Their language moves gradually from emotion toward structure, not because they have lost the capacity for feeling, but because they have already encountered the consequences of attachment in the real world. Meanwhile, those who have not yet crossed that threshold naturally speak in the language of freedom and possibility. And that too is not a mistake. It simply means they are standing at the doorway of an experience they have not yet fully lived. In our next lecture, titled Divorce Experience Part 3, we will explore this difference even further. We will examine how people speak about responsibility and conflict once relationships reach deeper levels of commitment. Especially interesting is the moment when conflict appears. Some people explain conflict by blaming external circumstances. Others explain it by examining the structure of the relationship itself. And through that difference, the hidden presence or absence of past relationship experience often becomes surprisingly visible. Relationships begin with feelings, but lives are shaped by the choices those feelings lead to. If this lecture offered you a new way of observing relationships, please consider subscribing and sharing this talk so that others can explore these ideas as well. In the next episode, we will go even deeper into the psychology of commitment and the hidden structures that reveal how people truly understand relationships.